Welcome, everyone. My name is Damon Wilson. I'm the president and CEO of the National Endowment for Democracy, and I want to welcome all of you. Thank you for joining us online today and around the world for this discussion on winning the battle of ideas, exposing global authoritarian narratives, and revitalizing democratic principles. This is the backdrop of discussion around an important report that the National Endowment for Democracy's International Forum is launching today. The premise of today's discussion is simple. It's that democracy is under attack. Autocrats are waging a war against democracy around the world, and democracies have been slow to recognize this. But here at NED, we do recognize this. We're focused on what not just what to do to protect democracy, but how can we help renew democracy and challenge autocracy? So today's conversation is an opportunity for us to dig deep into what we call one of the defining challenges to democracy today: combating authoritarian narratives and strengthening narratives of democratic resilience. Democracies are engaged in what is an ideological competition with autocracies that could reshape the global order in ways that could disadvantage democracy. We see that authoritarians, they take ideas seriously. They try to appropriate democracy itself. And in this fiercely competitive global environment, democracies must compete. We've seen that autocracies have been on the offensive and working together in what our board member, Ann Applebaum, has written about as Autocracy, Inc. So here at the Endowment, we understand that our partners, that Democrats around the world need to do the same in what we call shorthand Democracy United. We know that the NED partners and civil society around the world are dealing with this challenge in their everyday work. Combating authoritarian influence is a key priority for the International Forum for Democratic Studies here at the Endowment, which has organized today's session to help sort of deepen understanding and accelerate our learning on this defining challenge. So this report underscores the importance of a positive agenda for democracy, which was a core theme that Larry Diamond sort of laid out at our signature Lipset lecture at the end of last year to sort of set the tone for the conversation, our work in 2024. So I want to thank and acknowledge the team that's come together to make this work. First, our report author, you'll hear from Dr. Joseph Siegle, who's at NDU. Our moderator, our good friend, Josh Rogan, a columnist for the Washington Post, someone who's been eloquent on these issues in his writing. And extraordinary commentators, beginning with NED board member, our vice chair, Ambassador Jendai Frazier, who's been a remarkable voice about authoritarian influence across Africa. Peter Pomerantsev, who's been defining this field with his research and analysis, with an extraordinary new book coming out on how to win an information war. And even Ivan Siegle, the executive director of Global Voices, who's been an important voice on this topic. I also just want to acknowledge our forum staff that has contributed to make this work, this report a reality, from Chris Walker, John Glenn, Kevin Shives, John Engelken, and Ariane Gottlieb. Thank you for all of your efforts. And with that, Josh, I'm going to turn it over to you to lead their conversation. We look forward to the debate. Thank you, Josh.
Thank you, Damon. Thank you, all of you online, for joining us. My pleasure to be a part of this event. As someone who has covered the struggle between democracies and autocracies in Washington, I welcome the basic frame of this report, which is, as Damon said, that democracies are engaged in ideological competition with autocracies that could reshape the global order. I think that sentence itself should stop us in our tracks. It's clear to me that from my experience in Washington as a journalist that we've lost the thread on this discussion, especially with the American people. Most of my readers don't think about democracy and why it matters on a day-to-day basis. And in journalism, it seems that when we talk about the ideological battle, it's mostly to talk about why we need to avoid it rather than engage in it. Seems to me that democratic societies haven't woken up to the fact that there is an ideological war going on, and they are not fighting it. And by not fighting it, they are, in a sense, losing it. So we either have to be in it or not. And if we are in it, we should be in it to win it. So now that we've defined the problem, the challenge is to craft solutions. And I think this report does a really good job of kickstarting that discussion. It's clear, again, to me, just having watched these issues in Washington over the years, that the infrastructure that we built, both in the government and in our civil society, for public diplomacy, public broadcasting, that allowed the messages of democracy to spread around the world have become obsolete. And the autocracies have somehow managed to lead progress, both in terms of technology, state media, and social media, not just in their own backyards, but around the world. With that said, I now would like to introduce the author of the report, Dr. Joseph Siegle, to give us a 10-minute or so explanation of what his research found and what his ideas are for solving these problems. Very briefly, Dr. Joseph Siegle is the Director of Research and Strategic Communications at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies at the National Defense University. And he has written widely on these trends with a focus on strengthening democratic accountability. After your presentation, Dr. Siegle will go to Ambassador Fraser, Peter, and Ivan for a discussion and then a question and answer. I turn the microphone over to you, Dr. Siegle, and thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much, Josh, and thank you, Damon. An honor to be part of the panel today. I want to thank all of the National Endowment for Democracy colleagues who were so instrumental in generating this report. So I'd like to start in West Africa, where in the wake of a string of coups that we've seen in recent years, one often hears the mantra that democracy has failed. And this narrative contends that because the civilian leaders in democratic leaning governments were alleged to be corrupt or unable to address the advancing violent extremist insurgencies in their countries, that the military takeovers were justified. Notably, this narrative is not just made by the juntas themselves, but by journalists and analysts and officials with international organizations. Less well recognized is that this narrative is very much part of the messaging that Russia has been promulgating in an orchestrated campaign across social media platforms, local influencers, and state media, with the aim of shaping public perceptions about the inefficacy of democracy in West Africa. Russian state broadcaster RT Español, meanwhile, has a similar message for its 14 million viewers in Latin America, where democratic leaders in the region are routinely characterized as agents of Western imperialism while providing ideological cover for authoritarians like Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Cuba. In the Middle East and the Arab world, in the Middle East and in Asia, CCP narratives often invoke the principles of non-interference in state sovereignty and encouraging pushback against democracy. As Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has put it, quote, whether or not a country is a democracy and values human rights is up to itself to decide, end quote. Of course, by country, he means regime in power. These narratives are part of a broader strategy being advanced by global authoritarians, primarily Russia and China, but also Venezuela, Iran, and others, to foster disillusionment with democracy by stoking emotive issues, enabling local authoritarians, and extending global authoritarian influence. These narratives are impactful because in a foreign policy context, they create worldviews that people use to interpret events. And doing so shapes the policy space. It affects governance norms, it affects the relationships between governments in a region, and it affects the affinity of governments to join global coalitions. So understanding these narratives is more than just a public diplomacy issue. It's more than just a democracy and governance issue. This is a central factor in international relations today, and it is shaping the contours of the evolving global order. The dissemination of global authoritarian narratives has surged in the past decade, 15 years, as a result of a confluence of overlapping factors. In the wake of the third democracy wave from the 1980s to the 2010s, we saw for the first time a majority of the world's governments become democratic leaning. And this put global authoritarians on the defensive and feeling increasingly isolated. In the subsequent period of democratic backsliding, to which global authoritarians contributed, it created openings for resurgence in global authoritarian influence. And this has similarly fostered greater assertiveness on the part of global authoritarianism to challenge the normative superiority of democracy, which they recognize puts them at inherent disadvantage. The past decade has also seen a surge in the number of online users. We've seen the number of people using social media grow from 1.4 million to about 1.4 billion to 4.7 billion today. Most of these are in the global south. And this has given global authoritarians unprecedented ability to reach far more extensive audiences than ever before at limited cost. So it's become a very powerful asymmetric tool. The breadth, speed, consistency of access to these populations around the world is a key differentiating feature of today's influence operations from what we've seen in previous eras. And some of the most common authoritarian narratives that we hear are that democracy is a threat to state sovereignty and non-interference, that the grievances of the global south are a result of Western exploitation, colonialism, or the Western-dominated global order, that democracy has failed to deliver and is characterized by corruption, which is a particularly potent charge given the importance that public trust plays in a democracy. Collectively, these ostensible deficiencies are cited as justification for a new multipolar order. And unspoken in this is that this new order is actually a reversion to a pre-United Nations non-rules-based order where global authoritarians would not be accountable for the violating the territorial integrity of neighbors or for human rights abuses they commit domestically. So in effect, these authoritarian narratives are attempts to draw a false equivalence between democracy and authoritarianism as equally viable governance systems. So what should be done? Let me highlight 3 priorities for action from the report. First, democracies from around the world need to elevate the priority given to democracy in their foreign policy calculus and commit to democratic solidarity by proactively supporting democratizers and democratic practices, especially when they come under attack. Undermining democracy has become a key tenet of global authoritarian strategy and as part of their attempt to shape the global governance playing field. The shrinking number of democracies that we're seeing in turn has direct implications for a vision of a more stable, prosperous world or addressing the many transnational threats that democracies that are around the world are trying to grapple with. So supporting democracy cannot just be a second or third tier priority, but it has to be weighted on par with our economic and security interests and then supported with political, economic, and security resources. A second priority is democracies need to regain control of the democracy narrative. An information vacuum has allowed global authoritarians to define democracy in some parts of the world. And democracies need to remind audiences that democracy provides better guarantors for basic freedoms like speech and press, assembly, religion, and property, the right to vote, as well as a check against impunity. This includes claiming democracy's performance advantages. For example, among low-income countries around the world, the median per capita growth rates in democracies tend to be a third faster than low-income autocracies. Educational attainment rates are about 25% higher. Life expectancies are about 6 years longer. And tellingly, with regards to corruption, and I believe we have a slide from the report we can show. Remember, corruption is a key authoritarian narrative that is used to try to undermine support for democracy, we find that there's a huge gap. Using Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index, we see that looking at all countries around the world, the median ranking for authoritarians is 142 out of 180 countries on the index. Democracies, in contrast, have a median ranking of 41. So there's a full 100-point differential in levels of corruption. And so there are real differences for citizens depending on which type of governance system they're living with. Consider people living in North Korea versus South Korea, or Venezuela versus Colombia, or Zimbabwe and Botswana. The last priority I would hold out is the importance of investing in building counter-disinformation capacity in the global South, and especially helping journalists, fact-checkers, civil society actors to gain the tools to both identify and push back against global authoritarian narratives and disinformation. Local actors are the best suited to identify these narratives and to counter them within local contexts that are meaningful for these audiences. Yet they shouldn't have to try to figure it out on their own, especially given that these narratives are often coming from outside. So there's a lot more that can be done in terms of building up technical capacity and lesson sharing, but these efforts are dramatically under-resourced, and so there's a lot more that can be done. So in conclusion, global authoritarian narratives are trying to make democracy seem risky and thereby justify prioritizing regime interest over citizen interest. Democratic actors need to push back on these narratives and remind citizens that by giving up on their political rights and civil liberties, they not only become less free, but they also become less well off, less secure, and with less agency to address the grievances that they face. So with that, let me stop and look forward to the follow-up conversation.
Thank you so much for taking us through the framework of your report. Now I'd like to turn to our panel for some analysis. First, I'd like to introduce Ambassador Jendai Fraser, who is a member of the NED board, a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford, an adjunct senior fellow for Africa Studies at the Council of Foreign Relations, and just had a legendary career as a U.S. diplomat and Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, top NSC National Security Council staffer, and I think the first female U.S. ambassador to South Africa. Ambassador Fraser, we'd welcome your thoughts on any of what Dr. Siegle just laid out. But let me ask you to sort of focus on one of the things he mentioned toward the end of his introduction, which is this idea that the global South is particularly neglected by our democracy advocacy and information warfare and information shaping efforts. Can you draw from your experience in the region to talk about the challenges that are particular to that region, whatever you define as the global South and Africa in particular, and we'd welcome any other thoughts that you may have on what we're discussing. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Josh, and thank you, Dr. Siegle, for this really important report. I think that the report on the battle of ideas and the narratives of authoritarianism really hit some fundamental points, particularly when I think of the global South. Of course, I'm not going to talk broadly about all of it, but of Africa, and the narrative of Western exploitation. I mean, I think is extremely salient. Democratic failure, as you said, with the coups that we've seen of late. And this notion of a new world order based on multipolarity and non-interference. I think that those messages are especially salient across Africa. And I also think the report is very perceptive in its statement that China and Russia do not directly sell authoritarianism, which would be a losing hand, but instead they appeal to these themes of popular appeal. Because across Africa, from decolonization forward, the idea of democracy, or at least the idea of freedom and being able to have self-rule and self-governance and self-determination is as powerful a theme as the others that I just mentioned. So I guess the question is, why is these themes of Western exploitation, democratic failure, and the need for a new world order so popular? Is this an outcome of Russia's extensive disinformation campaigns, which are quite serious? And Dr. Siegle and the folks at ACSS have done excellent work tracking these disinformation campaigns. Is it because of China's extensive propaganda campaigns, with putting over $10 billion annually towards its propaganda to say that the CCP is a better system than democracy, to push the narrative, particularly in the global South and in Africa, that China's done more than any other country to lift millions of people out of poverty, whereas the West, with all its aid programs, have failed? Is that the reason? Or is it because, and I would argue this as well, Africa's low priority in our Western foreign policy, particularly the United States? And basically what I'm saying is that in addition to us having this push on these authoritarian side, on the information space, has been our own neglect, and our own quote unquote pivot to Asia, and absolutely ignoring Africa. And the Africans are not missing this fact. They hear, because we're articulating it very clearly, where our priorities globally are in Indo-Pacific, et cetera. And Africa is never mentioned in that. And so I think that one of the points of the report is the need to align our interests with our values. And in that point that was made by Dr. Siegle, he's essentially saying that we need to build a community of democracies, which the Biden administration had a false start trying to do, but recognizing that many of these countries in Africa that we don't consider strategic partners or allies or of high vital interests are in fact struggling democracies, so their numbers count. And when we ignore these democracies, for example, what happened in Niger with the coup with the former president, we highlighted him during our US-Africa summit as this great democratic leader, but when he's overthrown by his military, there's not really a response from the West. We pack our bags and go home, essentially, although the US hasn't quite packed its bags there. But so I think that this question of aligning interests and values, we've never gotten right. When we set up the Bretton Woods institutions, and when we set up the United Nations at the end of World War II, based on the Atlantic Charter, which said that we were going to respect the self-determination of people globally, and then we didn't do that, I think that then leads to these perceptions that the authoritarians are able to exploit quite effectively. So what can we do? What can we do about this? I think, again, more than what we say is what we do. And then can we also articulate what we're doing in a more favorable light to ourselves? I think that there's a lot of attention that needs to be put there, but the doing is really what has the most impact. Secondly, I think that the transparency and openness of our society and our politics is exploited by these authoritarians. And so maybe what we need to have is more reporting on China and the Soviet Union and their internal affairs and problems, what Dr. Siegle calls challenging the claims of authoritarianism to performance legitimacy. Let's talk about China's response to COVID, or its population strategies, or Ukraine, Russia's disastrous attack against Ukraine. I think that really looking internally at the internal affairs of these countries, as much as they do us, is going to be important. And then finally, let me just say that I 100% agree with him on the need to build a healthy information ecosystem. Right now, there's about 5,000 public diplomacy professionals at the State Department. We really need to invest in this area much more significantly than we are currently. And so I really associate myself with training journalists to fight this battle, not only in the United States, but across African countries, as China has done, buying broadcasting and training journalists. Let's step up our game as well. And so with that, I look forward to additional discussion.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. There's a lot of good stuff in there. I had no idea there were 5,000 public diplomacy professionals in the State Department. And it certainly seems that we have the right people, and we have to just give them the right tools and the right support. Let me now turn to Peter Pomerantsev, who is an award-winning author and academic, especially in authoritarian propaganda and disinformation. His newest book, How to Win an Information War, is due out next month. It tells about the Allied operation to undermine Nazi propaganda and its relevance today. Yes, it does seem like history, if it doesn't repeat itself, it certainly at least rhymes. And we've sort of forgotten the lessons, not only from World War II, but also the Cold War, where our ability to tell the story of free societies made a big difference. We seem to have lost that thread. Peter, I'd love to hear if you agree with that, and also your thoughts on this report we're releasing today. And I give you the floor.
Josh, thank you. And thank you, Ned, for having me and for what is a superb report that I really hope will focus minds on the reframing of this issue. Something quite fundamental is happening. I think Damon mentioned this in the introduction. The other side, the enemies of democracy, do see what is going on as a war. That's how they frame it. And I can't, tell you how many times now across the world I've met with people who are part of the NED community or like the NED community, these brave, incredibly courageous civil society organizations. I saw them in Russia in the early 2000s, in Hungary more recently, in Georgia the last couple of years. And all of them, it's almost always the same expression on their faces. This sort of moment where they're like, how come we're under attack? We do nice things. We help people. And why are we under attack? I mean, it happened very early in Russia. Putin decided to go after civil society through all the mechanisms available to him, through repression, through narrative attacks, through legal mechanisms, through violence. It's a strategy that authoritarians have to go after the sort of community that NED and other democracy-supportive organizations foster. And we have this incredible mismatch in the field between states with all their narrative, propaganda, and repressive mechanisms, and NGOs who were always, felt strongest because the people were on their side. They were helping people. What could be wrong with, I don't know, election observers in Russia, like Golos, or people helping, I don't know, helping you with your judicial rights in Central Europe. They were always on the side of the people. And suddenly, through a very, very sustained propaganda campaign, they were made the enemies of the people. They were made the targets of authoritarian propaganda. And they became sucked into a new game where simply going with the grain or going with the flow of ever-rising democracy that was seemed to be happening from 1989, where it's just a question of, how will countries become more democratic, was suddenly reversed. And we may not like the language of security. We may reject instinctively the language of, saying everything is weaponized and so on and so forth. We may not like the language of war. Most of the people in our community instinctively shy away from that. But whether we like it or not, the other side is at war with us. And that does mean a paradigm shift. That means a real shift in understanding the environment around us. I'm very happy not to use the language of the battlefield and all this stuff, but I just don't know which other one to use. But it does mean starting to think in a very different way. Let me give one example, I think, where I see that happening. Maria Ressa in the Philippines, Nobel Prize winner, I'm sure we know her well, was the editor-in-chief of a very, very inventive online news media, which found itself under vicious attack from the previous Philippine government. And it was this wave after wave after wave of online attacks saying they are enemies of the people. I think that they're funded by Ned. I think that was part of it. Definitely that they're funded by Amidjar. That they are traitors. How dare they criticize our president? These people are enemies of the people. And at first they were completely confused. They were like, oh my God, what on earth is going on? Why are we under attack this way? And in a while they realized this wasn't organic. You know, these were organized, what we would now call coordinated, inauthentic behavior, online troll farms funded and supported by people around the government. It's not always the government itself these days. It's often like a whole industry around the government doing its bidding, attacking them. We see the same thing happening in so many countries that Ned is active in, across Europe and Latin America and so forth. And it was a real change talking to Maria, the editor-in-chief of this organization, as slowly she realized that she was in a completely different game. That simply talking about this is wrong and we are right, and then trying to win a moral argument is not enough. You've got to make it, but it's not enough. And they started thinking about the environment. Okay, let's not use the military metaphors, like an election campaign would, like campaigners would. They built this very, very sophisticated AI machine that would start detecting, is an attack coming at them? Who's behind the attack? Is it worth responding? So essentially, like, you know, maybe like an election campaign would, if it's a good election campaign. They started thinking about target audiences. Who do they have to reach? Where are the levers of power? Where are the levers of influence? So they started thinking in a much more campaigny way with, again, we're going to use the word, a battlefield, clear aims, clear outputs, when you react, when you don't react. I mean, that is a sea change for a lot of, like, you know, small, gutsy NGOs. So the question for us, how do we keep that spirit going? How do we stay true to our values? But how do we start fighting like partisans in the Second World War? You know, how do we start, you know, applying the reality that we live in, which is an aggressive reality, and not one where there is a, you know, the arc of history, if ever it existed, has been bent so out of shape. We really need to start fashioning it into swords.
Another call to action, and a very welcome one at that. Thank you. Yes, it is. There are advantages and disadvantages to thinking about this as a war, but it's clear that our adversaries think about it that way. So that's something that we just can't ignore. Let me turn now to Ivan Siegle. No relationship, by the way, to Dr. Joseph Siegle. He's the executive director of Global Voices, which is a community of writers, journalists, and translators and activists that is engaged in the very important mission to bring new and authentic and local voices to these important international conversations. And from that perspective, I'm wondering, Ivan, if you can react to what you've just heard, but also talk about how, as you go about the worthy mission of elevating all of these citizen voices, how do you see authoritarian narratives and freedom narratives competing against each other, and how do you see that playing out from the ground up as people begin to take more control over their own narratives and their own stories? Thank you so much.
Thanks, Josh. Hi, everybody. Great to be here today. So I think I want to start by talking a little bit about experience of countries themselves, what happens inside of countries as authoritarian states, as a reflection of what's happening globally. Over the past few years, Global Voices has studied this issue pretty intensively in about 20 countries, looking at a variety of political systems, from military dictatorships to one-party states to authoritarian democracies with populist leaders. And what we've found is that narrative persuasion in authoritarian contexts rarely operates alone. We usually see it in concert with regulatory and technical efforts to reduce rights and freedoms in other arenas, such as access to information, the use of communications tech unfettered by surveillance, data privacy. And then the question becomes, what's the specific nature of these repressions? So we've looked at, in dozens of cases, the most common thing what we've found is that we see an appeal to narratives that are technically true under international law that help to justify a broad array of restrictions. And that is, freedom of expression is not an absolute right. And technically that's right. So we see these kinds of slight shifts in how acceptable or existing language is used to then justify restrictions. So you can look at Turkey, for example. And by the way, this stuff has been happening for more than a decade, so it's not new. I mean, we've been documenting and tracking this kind of thing since the mid-2000s. It's the scale of it is certainly impressive these days, but we have a long history here. So looking in the Turkey context, and say Article 19 of the Article 299 of the Penal Code, where it's illegal to insult the president. This is justified by narratives around moral hygiene and national security, and it's been around since 2014. Some 100,000 people have been accused of it. And in order to use this narrative, it builds on a range of rights restrictions to preempt and enforce. So that kind of pairing of surveillance technologies, mass surveillance of populations, individual targeted surveillance, and is very much linked to activities to a certain kind of state-driven narrative. We see that in lots and lots of countries and lots of different manifestations. Another point is that, well, authoritarians have many more repressive mechanisms at home than they do abroad. So we do see that, a state can do something like that, but they can't do it in the same context internationally because they don't necessarily control the international system. So to point to Dr. Siegle's, his report really strongly points out their efforts to change the current international order. And I think that's absolutely correct. What they're trying at home, they want to try abroad, but they have to do it differently. And that means by working in partnership with like-minded governments or attempting to change the rules that undergird the current international order. It's also important to recognize that authoritarian narratives aren't uniformly effective. They seem to be most powerful when they tap into some truth, whether that's current or historical. And when in studying this, we see a really persistent effort to justify authoritarian acts in terms of public safety, national security, and public health, as well as mobilizing populist narratives that define in-groups and demonize enemies. Those are the kind of consistent things that we've seen across almost every country we've studied, that it's not ad hominem attacks. It's always attacks that are linked to something that can be justified in existing frames and reframing events that are occurring in the language of security or safety. There are some really interesting outliers, especially around democracies that have authoritarian and populist leaders who have come to power via democratic processes. And this is the only place where authoritarian and anti-authoritarian sides are actually employing the same narratives. And a very common one is that freedom of expression is a narrative supported by democratic rights activists in most of the world. But in some kinds of populist democracies, information operations and influence campaigns are itself defended by states with a deceptive argument that they should be protected as free expression. So for example, in Brazil under Bolsonaro, attempts by the judiciary to curb disinformation and misinformation campaigns run by Bolsonaro using state resources were vilified by sectors of society aligned with him as censorship. So we see this kind of inversion of the normal expression in which censorship is being democratic activists are being accused of censorship under these kinds of specific populist regimes, and they're being used to exploit existing societal divisions to stoke hatred, undermine social cohesion, erode trust in democratic institutions from within. And that is a space where we see that happening an awful lot at the kind of the bleeding edge of democratic states that are facing like a growth of populist expression. The Philippines, Hungary, India, Brazil. There's another half dozen countries that we could talk about. So that just helps to, I hope, to give a bit of a frame for what's happening internally and how that can be applied or imagined in the external context. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Evan. Yes, I couldn't agree more that the fascinating trend of disinformation campaigns, hiding behind the narrative of free speech and free expression, and popping up in our own society as well. But perhaps that's a conversation for another panel. But now I want to sort of open up the discussion based on the thing that you said just before that, which I also found really useful, which is your point that authoritarian narratives seem to be most powerful when they tap into some truth. And, this is the part of the panel where we sort of kick the tires on this report to understand really, is it really all about narratives, or are there some underlying causes here that are related to the fact that the authoritarian information efforts are gaining a lot more traction? So let me turn back to you, Dr. Siegle, not Mr. Siegle, and put that question to you. It seems that there are these countries, especially in the global south, but not just in the global south, have a lot of grievances, legitimate grievances, with the way that the democratic world has treated them, and the promises that haven't been fulfilled, and the lack of credibility of some of the values that we profess to champion. And how do you factor that into this calculation, Dr. Siegle? And from your, especially focusing on the global south, how do you recommend that we rectify it? Can we fix the narrative problem without fixing the underlying strategy and policy problems?
Yeah, thanks, Josh. I think it's a really critical issue. There are a plethora of grievances in the global south. These countries are, of course, among the poorest in the world, and this was always going to be part of the challenge of democratization in the developing world, is that they were starting at such lower levels of economic development and education and a whole host of other challenges out there. Let's not forget, nearly all of them started and have long legacies as authoritarian governments. And so they're having to transition from that as well. And so I think we really need to take this head on, because there are going to be grievances with us for years to come. And what I would like to see is a fostering of a culture of democratic self-correction to deal with this. And, that means we need to prioritize civic education, that democracy is not a magic wand that is going to solve all of the problems. What it does do is give you the tools to deal with the grievances that you have. And if that's about corruption, then democracy and civic activism can help foster and create cultures of transparency, free press, builds up independent anti-corruption commissions. If you have problems with security, there's ways of mobilizing a cross-sectional security task force that can help mobilize the support that is going to be needed to deal with the insurgency. If it's about accountability, there's ways of strengthening and building up public protectors' offices or ombudsmen. So there's a whole host of things that democracies can do to help create the independent bodies that lead to better performance and better accountability. I think the main message is that we need to move away from focusing just on the problems to focusing on what you can do about that, and that having more citizen agency is going to help rather than having less citizen agency, which is what you get with authoritarian reversal. I think proactively getting out these messages and making that part of democratic civic education is important for inculcating these cultures of democratic self-correction, and then inoculating against the authoritarian narratives that are always going to try to weaponize these grievances.
Excellent, thank you. Yes, there seems to be a lot of good options for things that we can and should do, but let me turn to you, Ambassador Fraser, to answer this question: why aren't we doing them? What's the holdup? I noticed in your comments that you said the Biden administration has had what you called a false start in trying to build a community of democracies. To be fair to them, and this is not a political comment, during the Trump administration, there was a de-emphasis on this. I remember when the State Department tried to cancel the community of democracies altogether. But it is true, objectively, that the Biden administration announced a return to a commitment to promoting democracies and fighting the authoritarian narrative. And, it's been a mixed bag. We have to just be honest about that. And I think that's what you were alluding to in your opening, but I'd love to hear more about that from you, Ambassador Fraser. What's going right now in the U.S. government? What's going wrong? And why do you think that, what was heralded by this administration as a return to a commitment to these values hasn't produced the results that many had hoped?
Well, I think that first of all, there's a certain taken for grantedness about democracy and the success of democracy. And I think that, we've been, in the United States, we have been the shining, thing on the hill, whatever Reagan said, right? We've been the model for what democracy is globally. I don't think that we have actually not been promoting democracy. We do promote it at the embassy level and at the, the executive level. Each one of these elections that happen, we send monitors, we send messages, we're out there pushing. Ned is out there pushing, working with civil society organizations. So I don't think that we have not been engaged in trying to support Democrats or democratic tendencies in these countries. So I don't think that's the issue. I think the issue partly is that there used to be a thing called foreign policy and domestic policy, internal affairs and external affairs. That doesn't exist anymore. And so when we talk about the revolution of social media, the fact of the matter is the interdependence of our countries and of the information space is that everybody in Africa can see what's going on in the United States in that pillar of a democracy. Everyone sees polarization, as CNN talks about it every day. Everyone sees how bipartisanship is starting to be seemingly a thing of the past when we try to solve our policy issues. And it's that transparency and that openness and that lack of an external versus domestic space that is exploited by the authoritarians, right? They take these challenges, which actually, when a society has a lot of challenges and it's able to solve those challenges, it is in fact the strength of democracy, right? That's one of the reasons why I think Nigeria is going to be okay, right? Because they've had a lot of challenges and they solve those challenges. And you build that democracy. Democracy, as they say, is not a destination, it's a process. It's a continuing process. It's the reinventing of ourselves. And so I think that, part of the challenge is that we aren't trying to explain ourselves globally. I think Linda Thomas Greenfield at the UN did this very effectively when she first went to the UN, when she said, America's not perfect, but we are on the track, right? We're making progress. The trend lines, as Dr. Siegle says in his report, we've got to look at the trend lines that is progress being made. So I think that that's a big part of it. We take it for granted. We don't therefore explain what appears to be dysfunction, but is actually, in fact, the strength of democracy, because in the building of it, we're making it a stronger institution and governance system for all of us.
On a good day, I think that is absolutely true. I'm not sure, looking at our Congress today, this would be the best day to shine that light on.
We've survived it all. We've survived it all. We'll continue to survive it.
Yes, I'm sure we will. I'm hoping that we have a slightly better story to tell than the one that we're seeing on C-SPAN today. But let me leave my editorial comments aside and move to Peter, because Peter, this sort of segues right into sort of what you were talking about, which is the sense that we're not organized really for this new, not to torture the metaphor, but this new battlefield, this new organization of how both national power and media power and civil society groups are all sort of being abused by authoritarians to just flood the zone with a ton of information that our systems are not really suited for. It seems like we're outgunned and outmatched. I'm wondering, do you agree with that? And can you give us some specific examples of how we can take all of these good ideas and actually improve or fix or restore or modernize or build the infrastructure that we would need to actually compete the way that the competition is going in 2024, not in in the 1990s?
Sure. I think firstly, I would look at the countries where this is truly existential, because often they're the ones innovating, and they're the ones innovating to survive. So I'm thinking of Estonia, thinking of Ukraine, I'm thinking of Taiwan. And I'm thinking there they've had to really think about, given this profusion of rhetoric, where so much of the language around democracy, even the language of rights, has been undermined very effectively by a very nihilistic, but very targeted and well thought through propaganda. How do we go back to what we call democracy? And we've used that term so many times already in today's conversation, around it having meaning. It almost sort of stopped using that word for a while. They've kind of wasted that word. The word freedom has been bent into so many shapes. It's really unclear what it means a lot of the time. And there is an experience of democracy, which is an experience of feeling empowered, of being empowered, of having agency. When people look to authoritarian leaders, they're kind of sublimating their agency through them. We've had a good, going back to the Second World War, a good sort of like 70 years of sort of psychological research into why people look to authoritarian leaders when they've given up on their own sense of agency. They look to others to do it for them. Conspiratorial thinking is deeply linked to a lack of a sense of agency. You feel you can't do something, and you need a conspiratorial framework to explain the world, give you a sense of community, give you a leader who will do things for you. So there is an essential democratic experience, a sort of spirit of democracy, which I think we have to go back to finding, and not the rhetoric. And a few little sort of initiatives come to mind. In Ukraine, DIA, this sort of government portal that allows people through digital means to have lots of democratic experiences, more control over local budgets, more control over government services in an app. Very, very empowering. In Taiwan, VTaiwan, this sort of an algorithm, essentially, actually invented in America, but only used in Taiwan, that brings people on different sides of the argument together in a sort of like kind of a positive version of Twitter, if you can imagine that, where it looks for the strongest underlying arguments around polarizing issues to bring people to a policy consensus. So imagine an algorithm that is not driving us apart, but an algorithm bringing us together. And in Estonia, many, many experiences with e-governments and so on. So these are all about the experiences of empowering people to take back control for real. So I think the more we get away from the rhetoric and the more we get to the experience, the democratic experience, the experience of having agency and of having meaning, I think that is a very, very important kind of baseline for us to return to. Well, yeah, maybe a moratorium and using the word democracy for a while might help, because it's been wasted by the other side. It's become a polarizing word in itself. But really getting back to why democracy matters to people, I think is a very healthy kind of place for us to consolidate around.
Excellent. I think it's very interesting and useful to look at these small democracies that are innovating, like Estonia and Taiwan, because of course they have the most recent experience with not being democracies, so they have a visceral understanding of what it means to lose that kind of autonomy and that kind of ability to determine their own future. But I think that's actually a very good segue, Ivan, to something that you were talking about, which is to look at those countries that are not doing so well. the countries that are slipping into authoritarianism, often through democratic means, often through semi-democratic processes. Hungary, Turkey, there's just a long list where these countries are becoming faux autocracies. They have the trappings of democracy, but actually it's a consolidated power structure that, as you rightly pointed out, always comes with repression, or it almost always comes with repression. How do we deal with those countries? How do we deal with the countries where they've kept just enough democracy to as a fig leaf over an authoritarian power grab? And if you could just keep this short so we could get to the lightning round, which I'm very excited about. Thank you.
Absolutely. So first by saying I totally agree with Peter's points. I think it's really, really important to look at the actual practice of democracy and to understand that, the information ecosystem that we're talking about is not only about journalism, not only about media, but also about information architectures that allow support and participation within democratic processes. My number one point here is that we should be focusing on showing, not telling. Democratic narratives, they're most effective when they come from diverse and pluralistic sources and from people who benefit from it themselves and their own advocates, rather than from government sources that seem to be dictating democracy. And this kind of top-down approach, which also existed after the collapse of the Soviet Union, with a kind of a centralized approach to democratization, seems to be echoed here as well. We really need to practice what we preach with regard to at home with dealings with citizens and in other countries if we want our arguments to stick. And when democratic governments are called out, for example, for supporting authoritarian states when it serves their geopolitical goals, as Dr. Siegle pointed out in his report, then these messages are perhaps rightly seen as hypocritical. So I want to add my voice to this general idea that democracies really need to focus on working. They are seen. Everything that happens internally is visible. And that's not a bad thing. That can be a strength. It should be a strength. Next point, narratives. Yeah, do I have time, or
Go ahead.
One more point then? Thanks. The next point is that the idea that authoritarian states have an asymmetric advantage in national narrative contestation, it's not quite right. Master narratives are certainly promoted by those states, and they're certainly powerful, but they don't work. They don't have uniform affect. China's Belt and Road Initiative, for example, it's a narrative that emanates from a centralized power. It's the polar opposite of the communications values of network societies and manifestations of open communications technologies. And those societies, with many nodes of power, many nodes of influence, they're bursting with local narratives, with creativity, with life. And they rely on deliberation and debate to construct a collective vision of the world. And they can work. And in studying, for example, the effects of the BRI narrative in many countries, it's failed. It fails because of the quality of Chinese goods in Ethiopia or poor and abusive labor practices in Nigeria. So it's really important to say that it's not like that war is, to use Peter's language, that war is over. It's not. A large extent, this is going to sit on whether or not we're actually able to shape an information ecosystem that supports information integrity and supports a plurality of perspectives, rather than turning the internet into television, or rather than turning it into a space that promotes polarization or promotes populism or promotes and there's lots of ways to do that and lots of projects that are working on that effect. So thanks very much.
Excellent. That perfectly tees up what I promise will be a very short lightning round. I'm going to be respectful of everybody's time. 4.7 billion people getting information from social media. By far the largest is TikTok, Facebook, Instagram. All of them hugely problematic in different ways. We've seen Congress try and fail to tackle this issue, but if we're going to build healthy information ecosystems to counter manipulation, it seems that eventually we have to confront the fact that the majority of Americans and people around the world, especially young people around the world, are getting their information from these platforms, which are managed and moderated in an opaque way, and in some cases controlled by those very adversaries that are pushing the authoritarian narratives that we're trying to combat. So 30 seconds each. Start with Dr. Siegle. What do we do about that? You have 30 seconds to solve the problem of regulating and understanding in social media?
Well, I think social media platforms are not going to do it themselves. They just don't have a financial interest. And so it's going to have to take government regulation that's going to require more of raising public consciousness and really recognizing that all sides of the political spectrum have value and trying to create a healthy, trusted ecosystem and finding that common ground to adopt that policy framework.
Excellent. Thank you. Ambassador Fraser.
I put more faith in the ability, particularly in Africa, people to be able to go back and forth. I mean, there are communities that debate each other fiercely on social media, and so I don't know about regulating them. We failed to do that quite significantly, but I do know that that platform creates a more pluralistic space for significant debate. I don't know how algorithms are pushing communities to be more polarized. I understand that that's also part of it. But if you get on social media with African communities, it's really quite entertaining, informative, and it actually is bringing, I think, communities together in many ways.
Interesting. Thank you, Peter.
So I think that this is about sort of fundamental rights, and I've always seen it this way. Doesn't matter. I mean, the effects are maybe even more parlous in countries where democracy is weaker. But there's a fundamental question here, like a First Amendment question for me. I, as someone who lives in America, or any American citizen, doesn't understand how the information environment around us is shaped. Yeah, we'd have more information than ever, but how it's shaped, what algorithm decides what you see, which of your data is being used, why are you seeing this thing and not another, what is the guy down the road seeing? We don't know that. So that is, for me, a clear case of censorship. We do not have access to that information. And that, for me, is just a complete abuse of our fundamental rights. If we want to talk about an information environment that's different between democracies and authoritarians, the Chinese and the Russian governments definitely do not want their people understanding their surveillance technology or having any kind of control over it. The difference should be not about moderating content, which is a very, very complex thing, and we have laws around that, but oversight of the algorithms that are influencing our lives is a basic right that we're lacking. And that should be the difference between their systems, which are closed, where you have no understanding of what the Chinese government is seeing, how it's influencing you, have no idea, and they want to keep it that way, between our ones, which will be pluralistic, chaotic, rambunctious, and yes, full of lies. That lies are part of democracy, by the way. But we have oversight over them because we're citizens. That, I think, is a fundamental thing that's missing. And what we're doing at the moment is not living in a free speech environment.
Fascinating. Thank you. And Ivan.
Yeah, here. Democratic states, we need to celebrate the plurality of perspectives and perspectives in our spaces, not be afraid of them. Now, oversight of social media platforms absolutely needs to happen, and that comes with other types of activities for citizens, like data portability. The ability to leave platforms is as equally important, and the ability to give people agency over their own data, their own information, to move from space to space is the second component to Peter's point around access for researchers, access for citizens into the activities, the functions, the systems that social media companies run. I could go on, but I know we have super tight time. But I would say that's the first point of attack, not restrictions on expression based on certain kinds of vulnerabilities. Thanks.
Excellent. Well, we could go on for hours, but we're not going to. To sum up, I think what we've learned here is that the information war is on, the ideological war is on, and if we do not engage in it, we will lose it. It seems that our adversaries, the authoritarians, are on the march, and our free and open societies are struggling to catch up technologically. There is a gap between our promises to the global South and what we can deliver, and also need to bolster democratic values inside of our own society so that we can model the behavior that we're promoting. I hope that everyone will go to the NED website and read the rest of this excellent report and continue engaging all of us in this important conversation. Thank you so much to NED for hosting, and thank you to our panelists for contributing. And this concludes this event.